I know a worship leader right now who is at a pretty large church, but they're one site. He said he's the only worship leader at his church right now. And I've asked him, I'm like, hey, are you guys going to do multi-site at any point in time? Like, if so, you'll probably need to. He said, yeah. He's like, we've had some people come through, but I just feel like at a church our size, you really need to have someone who's at least as good as I am to do it. And I'm like, man, he's a great worship leader. That's that's a high standard. Right. And I'm like, if you can get someone who can do it at least like 60 or 70% of as good as you, you probably need to go ahead and just start developing them and get them in. Yeah. So that, and so I think this has forced us into that mindset of like, man, when someone auditions, they may not be a rock star right away, but we have 23 worship leaders. And like I said, a lot of them, when they came in, had no experience, but just because they auditioned and because we have a pathway and a system to develop them, they've all almost like a good majority of them have already just like blown me out of the water with how much they have gone beyond how far I thought they would go. Right. And it's just like every single week and every time that I see them lead, I'm like, they just get better and better and better. Awesome, man. And I'm like, man, it's just exactly to your point. I'm like, multi-site is just a machine for being able to develop people, and it's amazing.
And the coolest part to me about that is, and our heart really over this and the language we've been able to put to it, it's like, man, that is so good for them. They're not, it's not just like a cog in the wheel that like, oh, okay, there's another site now, so we just need to churn out 10 clones that can help you do your thing. It's like, no, God, I mean, if you got, God gave them a voice, he gave them passions, talents. I'm not saying specifically a spiritual gift in this, although I don't think, my personal view is that spiritual gift inventories are not exhaustive. They're not meant to be. I think there's not enough, we could not name all the ways that God, wires people and passions and gifts and stuff like that. But what a cool thing for them. And like you said, man, yeah, they would have been fine to serve somewhere else. They could have served in kids or whatever. But when you feel the electricity of stepping into what God kind of uniquely wired you up to do, I mean, there's just something that happens, and for their development, for their spiritual growth and their depth, that's what excites me the most about this stuff.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
All right, hey guys, welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Andrew Hopper from Mercy Hill Church, and man, we're excited today to be diving into a topic that I think is going to be really integral for those of us that are trying to grow our churches so that we can go, which is what this podcast is all about. Today I have Pastor Jon Azzarello in the house with us. Jon leads and directs all things worship at Mercy Hill. Jon, it's good to have you, man. Tell us a little bit about your story and journey with Mercy Hill.
Yeah, it's great to be on. So I've been at Mercy Hill since the very beginning. The launch in 2012 of Mercy Hill was my first Sunday. So just kind of checking things out. And then I think it was about 2 or 3 months in, when I started leading worship. And then that was about the time you took me to lunch and said, hey, man, just keep doing it. And so I've been doing it ever since.
We don't have any money to pay you, but we'd love for you to keep doing this.
That's right. That's exactly verbatim what you said.
Oh, man. And you guys have been faithful to do it, man. That was 6 kids ago, too, probably. Maybe not 6.
4 kids ago, yeah. So,
okay, cool, man. So you guys are really into the arrows in the hand of a mighty warrior thing with your 6 kids. Now, I know that you think you're here to talk about worship team development, but actually I want to talk about Jake Paul, Mike Tyson fight. Okay, so did you stay up and watch it?
I did stay up and watch it, regrettably.
And everybody else who doesn't want to admit it now.
Worst decision of my life.
Dumbest thing we've ever done collectively. No, in all seriousness, hey, today's podcast is very laser focused. We're going to talk about a lot of different angles of it, but we want to get into worship leader development and also team development, because they're connected, but they're not exactly the same thing. Yeah. So, man, we just want to listen, we cannot grow our churches beyond the capacity of our worship teams available to grow their capacity, right? Mm-hmm. Because as the church grows, the services grow, the amount of things that happen outside of the Sunday morning experience grow. And then eventually, if people are into it, they start planting churches, certainly multi-site, and we're going to need to have a big capacity with that. So, Jon, you're an expert in this. Man, you've gone from when the church had one worship leader and that was it was you, to now, I don't know how many. I mean, I'd love to know what's the scope of your team now. I don't mean just staff, but even the volunteers in your ministry.
We have so worship leaders. We have 23 worship leaders, and then entire team is about 80 people.
Yeah,
including Espanol.
Right.
Yeah.
Man, that's incredible. So that's been a ton of scale, and there's been, I'm sure, pain that comes with that growth. But at the same time, it's been awesome to see. And as the church keeps moving forward, you guys, it's kind of creates that leadership vacuum. So we're going to get into all that stuff today. So the first thing, and I'm just going to steer the conversation today. So the first thing that I wanted to get your opinion on is we had a podcast that came out a little while ago. I think some people could even see it as a bit controversial when we started talking about church brands. And you've heard me talk about this in different staff prayers and things like that. We have no problem leaning into the fact that every church has a brand, even if they don't recognize it. And the reason I say that is because they're making decisions.
Yeah.
They're making decisions around what to sing, what's the space going to look like, what kind of font we're going to use, what's the location, what's it look like. I mean, and all those decisions end up going into a bucket, and that bucket ends up kind of creating an audience, right? And so, one thing you're really good at, you have your finger on the pulse of a lot of different genres and things like that. When we're talking about brand, and I want to get into the bigger question of how important it is to know who you are and lean into that. But before that, I mean, give us a landscape of some of the genres that are out there when it comes to worship culture in church today.
There's a lot. I mean, if you take all of it's kind of like food. It's like if you include all of the fusions of everything, there's just like so many. But I think you could probably boil them down to like 4 or 5 kind of main genres, and you can even attach them to kind of like their origin of like, hey, what church or who's writing specifically in these. So like modern hymns, so you think of like churches like Sovereign Grace, City of Light, people like Matt Boswell, and this is songs like In Christ Alone, Before the Throne, His Mercy is More. Then you have gospel, which is, songs like Jesus at the Center, people who are writing a lot of gospel. I mean, think of like Chandler Moore, C.C. Winans, and then you have, I would say CCM, which is really similar to modern worship, but I think where it's kind of different is like, it's a little bit more almost like radio. So like think Phil Wickham, K-Love stuff, even Chris Tomlin kind of, I feel like can fit into that. Maybe that's debatable. Then you have like worship.
How old is Chris Tomlin?
He's getting up there, man.
Okay, fourth.
He's not Mike Tyson old, but he's still crushing it though, man. So I feel like youth worship. So that's kind of like a big thing that like even churches who aren't necessarily just catering to youth.
Yeah, that's right.
So like Elevation Rhythm, Young and Free. That's like more poppy, more dancey, jumping around stage kind of stuff.
And that's our students are really bringing that in from camp, right? What's the Southeast and Southeastern?
They're killing it. SEU.
Yeah, SEU, yeah.
And then where I would say maybe most churches kind of in our stream land is like in modern worship, which is like, you have Elevation, you have Passion, you have Bethel, you have Red Rocks.
Okay, so you said the other one was modern hymn.
Yeah.
This is modern worship, is what you would say. Okay.
Yeah. Which is more like rock, but you have everything from upbeat to also slow, but you have, within those specifically, if you compare Elevation to Bethel, they're really different, even though most of the songs are all written from the same group of people, but I think the streams are pretty different.
Yeah. Man, that's a really good survey. And I know what you mean. Like, you start, if you said, hey, generally categorize preaching in 4 buckets, it'd be like, well, you'd want to nuance it to death and all that. But generally speaking, those are pretty good. And we would fall modern worship, maybe sprinkled modern hymns, sprinkled some gospel. How would you describe where we're at? It's like an Enneagram. You're this, but you're wing whatever.
Yeah. You do a little bit of all of it, probably to some degree. But I feel like the more that we kind of like what you're talking about, like kind of identify who we are, I feel like we've even narrowed that a little bit more because maybe we've tried, for example, some of the like more, youthful Elevation rhythm type stuff. And it's like, man, just because it's working at other churches or in our student ministry doesn't mean it's going to work, in our context of our Sunday gathering.
Yeah.
So I feel like we've kind of put our finger on it a little bit more of where we're at. So honestly, what that's kind of done is like it's narrowed it a little bit more.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I have found with church leaders, myself obviously included, is I think that sometimes vision for the worship culture can lag behind vision for the church, because a lot of lead guys, that's not their natural go-to. They're thinking about preaching, they're thinking about, man, what type of mountain we're going to climb next or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But what we have found, it feels like to me, is that kind of zeroing in and trying to cast vision around what you want it to be, which one of those buckets you're kind of going after, at least in a primary way. And let's get back to the topic here. It can be very attractive for it can help you in development. It can help you in attracting talent and developing talent when you know who you are.
For sure.
Speak to that for just a moment, because I can see the other way.
Mm-hmm.
Once you start narrowing, you start repelling people too.
Yeah.
And you got to kind of go through the pain of that. But
Mm-hmm.
but it's also going to be something that's attractive where people are jumping in because they see who you are and they see where you're trying to go.
Yeah. I mean, anything that is worth replicating, like if you're going to replicate something, you have to know what you're replicating.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is something you and I have even talked about before. Like, man, if you're not really even sure where we land in terms of like who we are, what is our sound, I mean, you don't always have to have that super defined in the nitty gritty right away, but I do think it's really important, because as soon as you start replicating, hey, we have 2 worship teams, 3 worship teams, 6 worship teams,
Right.
because of all the campuses, there is definitely a lot more. I mean, okay, everyone brings in a unique expression. I mean, they have their influences and their unique talents and all that kind of stuff. And, let's just say that you have a keys player who's classically trained, and you have a bass player who's like jazz, a jazz musician, and then you have like a rock drummer, and it's like, it's a little bit of a gamble to just put them in a room and just kind of like, all right, guys, here's a chord chart, here's the song we're playing, you might get some kind of really cool fusion thing out of it, but odds are it's just going to be frustrating, confusing. It's going to require more practice time to be like, no, actually. So then now it's hard enough to do that when you have one campus. But now if you're trying to be like, hey, 2, 3 campuses, and then you get all these people together and they're all bringing in their, kind of their own unique take on what they think it should be.
Right.
It just can be confusing, and it can be. So I think it's actually just really, it's a development thing, but it's just like clarity is kindness. It's like, man, when we could say, hey, this is who we are, this is what the expectation is. Now we set people up to be able to run with like a confidence. Hey, I know I'm going after the target. I'm helping, we're helping to define that bullseye for people. And I think that's important. Before we can duplicate and replicate, we have to know, hey, what is the bullseye? Like what exactly are we going for? So like, I mean, we have a document that has kind of, hey, here's who we are. And it has examples. It has everything from like musically, this is what we're going after. Because we've missed, I mean, we've even like literally put songs on before, and I mean, we've talked about this,
right.
And there's certain songs where it's like, man, this is maybe an awesome song. And other churches are like, this is great.
Right.
But in our context, in our culture, it just maybe doesn't work and it falls flat. And we're like, man, if we can avoid that,
Yeah.
So I think that's all kind of just.
I think there's so much work to be done to, from whoever is leading at the top, to try to get, like you said the question. That's a really good question. I think church planners and pastors need to wrestle with, what is our sound?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if, I realized failure for me, I mean, I feel like until about, I don't know when we started really talking about this a lot, maybe a year ago or something, like because my attitude with our worship team a lot of times was like, oh, it's fine, it's great, like you guys are doing awesome, it's like I wasn't. Now part of that is because too, that sometimes I don't feel like I have the best, I'm just not a great critic with that stuff. I mean, critic in a positive way. Like it's the same way if somebody asked me, hey man, how does my house look decorated? I'd be like, do not ask me that because I mean, I can tell you my opinion, but it matters pretty zero.
Yeah.
So so some of that was not even passive. I think it was just like, hey, you guys are going to have a better read on how this feels and stuff to me. But then I started realizing too, I don't know that I'm serving y'all the best if I'm not at least giving you guys some big thoughts that I have, not nitty gritty stuff, but I mean, just like big thoughts, like, when some of the examples of defining who we are, I've said, hey man, we don't want to do Jesus is my boyfriend songs.
Yeah.
Where, I don't think you like to do those songs either, do you?
No.
Okay. But you know what I'm talking about. It's like,
Yeah.
man, you sing a song and you're like, hey man, I just sang that song and I feel like you had me and Jesus out there walking down the beach holding hands in the rain, And I get it, man. Like, I've had people say, well, what's the problem with Jesus as a lover, as a metaphor? And I'm like, man, there's nothing wrong with it. I still can't sing that song though, And so we just kind of had to figure that out of like, hey, our church is going to lean masculine in that area. And it's just kind of part of it. I think we've talked about, we want to run the gambit of emotions, but I feel like we need to, I kind of tend a little bit toward pessimism and kind of melancholy in my life. I feel like I need to be lifted, I want to celebrate. I want to come in and be like, man, God is on the throne, Doesn't mean we never do anything that's down or somber, but we want it to kind of tend that way. Now I'm giving you 2, I've got 10 or 20 even, but it's good. I think it's been helpful for us that you guys hear that from me.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Just from the very high level, y'all are going to work it all out. But like, just to know, man, that is kind of where we're going. And some people aren't going to like that. But you said clarity is kindness, and the other people are going to like it, and it's going to attract who we.
For sure. And I think, I do think that like already the landscape of like worship music caters more to women. And you could just look at like Spotify stats to verify that.
Okay.
Because like, if you look at, hey, who listens to worship music? It's like usually like 70% female.
Yeah.
And I think that like worship music, it just kind of naturally is easier, I think, for ladies to engage with that already. So like my point is, if we're already kind of alienating men, but we're not trying to do that. But right. Like if music already kind of feels that way, it's like, man, what can we do to make that less? Because we don't want it to be where it's like, hey guys, close your eyes and think happy thoughts. Like you said, holding hands with Jesus on the beach. It's true. And it's just like, man, there are songs, and like, I get it. Like, yeah, it's the bride and the groom of Christ, and then there's like this, Jesus is our lover of our soul.
Yeah.
But being able to be, serious and be able to be sober-minded in worship in certain times without it feeling romantic.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That's a good distinction.
I think that's really important to do, because like we do have heavy moments with like reflection too, and we're not afraid of those. We definitely don't want that to be the overall. Like I think Randy said before, it's like almost like a 5-to-1 ratio of like, dude, it should be a little bit more joyful, more let's go, more celebratory than, hey, let's sit in our feels. But also, we do want to engage everyone's emotions, and there are people who are sad and hurting.
Yeah.
So we don't want to leave them out to dry either. But it doesn't mean we have to go full-blown romantic with them either, what I mean? So
yeah, and I think it's important to note too, this is and we talk about this a lot on this podcast, it's a very pragmatic issue, because if you had like a lead team that was way contemplative, that was way somber, that was way artistic, it would probably be better to lean more that way with like the worship,
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a team that from the front is like charging, hey, next mountain, next man up, let's go. Then, if your worship doesn't lean that way, it's going to be odd, because you're going to end up attracting one type of person to the preaching, a different type of person to the music, what I mean? Kind of thing. I don't know. So, all right, that's a really good discussion. Let's continue the discussion here. All right. I want to talk about Multisite for a moment. All right. So, one of the things that we talk about a lot on this podcast is the idea of how growth and stressing the system produces leaders to sustain it, to sustain growth, to sustain sending. We've talked a lot about how one of the secret sauces we believe of the church planting movements that are so successful is a lot of times they come out of growing multi-site churches. And people want to set up multi-site as the opposite of church planting. People want to say, well, we want to plant churches instead of going multi-site, it's very naive for a few reasons. Number one, you can never church plant your way out of a growth problem. You want a church planter, that takes 10 years to build, unless you just want to stick a sticker on a NASCAR of some youth pastor somewhere. If you want to actually build one, that's 10 years. And when they leave, they take 30 people. So just do the math.
Yeah.
If you got a growing church, that's never going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Multi-site's a growth issue. But the other thing we found is that multi-site in so many levels, and I've talked a lot about preachers with this, because I think a critique of multi-site is that it's a dynamic, it ends up being just all about one preacher. And I'm like, man, we end up developing a lot of preachers because of multi-site. That's the same. It's similar with worship, right? Like
For sure.
You mentioned, tell me the numbers again that you mentioned.
23 worship leaders.
And on the team?
80.
I mean, this is conjecture, but if we were a single site, one service or two, let's say one service a weekend, single site, how many people would be on that team?
Yeah, we'd have 2 worship leaders.
Right.
And probably 12 to 15 people on the team.
Man, it's just bears out in the numbers. I mean, again, this is not right or wrong. It's somebody wants to do church that way, do it that way. But sometimes these multi-site arguments are not just wrong, they're backwards. It's like, man, multi-site doesn't produce leaders. No, multi-site is probably the best leadership development tool the church has had in the last 30 years. What have you guys seen? We're going to plant a campus, stress the system, everyone freaks out. I've been in the meetings where it's like, how are we going to do this? But then some kind of way, God raises them up. It happens. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it creates way more opportunities. And I think where there's not opportunities, a lot of times people just are like, well, there's not a pathway for me to go. If there's already a drummer and a bass player and a worship leader that's the same every single week, then odds are musicians who come to your church are going to look on stage and be like, they got it covered.
Right.
They don't need me. I'm going to go serving kids or somewhere else. But when we're like, hey, we're raising up a new team, we're raising up a new campus, we're launching new stuff, it's like, hey, there's more opportunities. And so you would think at a church the size of Mercy Hill, it's like, hey, it's a big church, but we have multiple opportunities and we're constantly, like you said, we're sending out. And so like, man, in order to do that, we have to constantly be just like, adding new people to the team. And so new opportunities, a ton of people that, we're adding. And it's funny because when you said stress the system, like the first time that I was forced to have someone else lead worship was he's a great singer. I mean, Nate Smith.
Yeah.
So
former rock star.
Literally. And still led worship yesterday at one of our campuses. He was just coming in though. He was like, man, I'm just going to sing harmonies, play acoustic guitar. And for the longest time, it was just for the first year of Mercy Hill, I just led every single week and we just kind of rolled with what we had. And it wasn't until a Saturday night at our staff Christmas party, that I'm like, I have no voice. I literally
remember that. Yeah.
Do you remember that?
I do.
Complete like laryngitis. And so Nate, I just called up Nate Smith, or I texted him and I'm like, hey man, you got to lead tomorrow. Like 3 new songs you've never even heard before.
Wow.
And he just got thrown into it and he crushed it, And I can't tell you how many times I know a worship leader right now who is at a pretty large church, but they're one site. And he said he's the only worship leader at his church right now. And I've asked him, I'm like, hey, are you guys going to do multi-site at any point in time? Like, if so, you'll probably need to. He said, yeah. He's like, we've had some people come through, but I just feel like at a church our size, you really need to have someone who's at least as good as I am to do it. And I'm like, man, he's a great worship leader. That's right. a high standard. Right. And I'm like, if you can get someone who can do it at least like 60 or 70% of as good as you, you probably need to go ahead and just start developing them and get them in.
Yeah.
So that, and so I think this has forced us into that mindset of like, man, when someone auditions, they may not be a rock star right away, but we have 23 worship leaders. And like I said, a lot of them, when they came in, had no experience, but just because they auditioned and because we have a pathway and a system to develop them, they've all almost like a good majority of them have already just like blown me out of the water with how much they have gone beyond how far I thought they would go. Right. And it's just like every single week and every time that I see them lead, I'm like, they just get better and better and better.
Awesome, man.
And I'm like, man, it's just exactly to your point. I'm like, multi-site is just a machine for being able to develop people, and it's amazing.
And the coolest part to me about that is, and you know, our heart really over this and the language we've been able to put to it over the last few years, but it's like, man, that is so good for them. They're not, you know, it's not just like a cog in the wheel that like, oh, okay, there's another site now, so we just need to churn out 10 clones that can help you do your thing. It's like, no. God, I mean, if you got, you know, God gave them a voice, he gave them passions, talents. I'm not saying specifically a spiritual gift in this, although I don't think my personal view is that spiritual gift inventories are not exhaustive. They're not meant to be. Mm-hmm. I think there's not enough, we could not name all the ways that God, you know, wires people and passions and gifts and stuff like that. But what a cool thing for them. And like you said, man, yeah, they would have been fine to serve somewhere else. They could have served in kids or whatever, but when you feel the electricity of stepping into what God kind of uniquely wired you up to do, mm-hmm. I mean, there's just something that happens, and for their development, for their spiritual growth and their depth, and man, that's what excites me the most about this stuff. But it is stressful, right? I mean, you guys, there's no doubt, like coming out of COVID, and you know, I mean, I know it can stress you guys because it's like, dude, we don't have what we need, but it's like, that's always going to be the case in a growing environment. You never have what you need. If you ever have what you need, you're probably declining.
Yeah, COVID was unique because, you know, we're coming off of COVID, and people, we got half the amount of people on our team, and it's like, hey, let's launch a new campus. Why not? What's the worst that can happen?
We have to stress the system.
And we did. Yeah.
And we did. And here we are. And you're still alive.
We made it.
So we made it.
We made it.
Okay. Man, this is great. Okay, good discussion. Let me ask you one more thing here, and then we're gonna maybe leave it here, and then we'll get you back here to talk more about this stuff because it's so good. It's so practical, man. If guys are trying to grow a church so that it can go, you know, the worship team and developing that team can become the bottleneck. I mean, just like that. Mm-hmm. If you're not moving in that area, and a lot of these guys are going to have people like you who went from worship leader, which you still lead worship, obviously, but went from worship leader to a developer of teams. Mm-hmm. So, you know, one of the things I would say is, one of the things that we try to be really practical on this podcast, okay? Now, this is not true for everybody, but for most people listening to this that are trying to grow a church, people that come to their church, that is probably not literally the first church they've ever been to.
Right.
Okay. And that's fine. Like people move churches. So we have a deep belief that we need to do two things. Number one, we need to attract the talent that's there. And then number two, we need to develop new talent, right? So talk to me about that, those two. First, let's take attracting talent to begin with. But like, man, what are ways that we try to drag the magnet through the sand, so to speak, see what sticks? Because in any given weekend, I mean, there are probably even right now dozens of musically talented, gifted people that they've done bands, they were in the band, they've done church, they've done youth choir, but we don't know them yet.
Right.
How do we attract them?
Yeah, that is a great question. That's the question every worship leader is asking, and I feel like there's what we can do about that. I mean, excellence attracts excellence. Mm-hmm. That's like the easy low hanging fruit. So like, people want to be a part of something if they see that it's valuable and impactful, right? Like nobody wants to join a worship team if they feel like, man, this is kind of embarrassing. It doesn't sound great. Yeah. It sounds like they didn't rehearse. And so,
prepared.
Yeah. So even if someone's like, especially if someone is a good musician, they're like, I don't know that I want to be part of that. Or if the church maybe doesn't value worship and it just feels like it's kind of kicked to the, then I think maybe, people might not see the value in it. And so they may not want to commit because it's a big commitment too,
right.
You know?
Right.
But I think that when it is impactful and people are moved by it and they see like, man, how many people want to do, like even in a career, think of this broader, like in a career, want to do something because they were moved or changed by it, you know? Like honestly, I wanted to be a worship leader because I went to a Christian concert when I was younger, and something that the person said and did right before a song, it just like moved me. And I was like, dude, I want to do that, you know? So I think that's one of the best ways excellence can attract excellence. And then really practically speaking, there needs to just be a very clear pathway, you know? And I know that sounds like super obvious, but I think
No, that's good. That's really good. Yeah.
a lot of times people will be like, man, I would actually like to be part of this,
Right.
but I don't really know how to, and I don't really want to go. I have other things to do with my life than to go, like going through their website and trying to find, how do I audition? So it's like, we need to make it just a wide open door. It needs to be a really clear pathway. You should be able to navigate directly to our worship page. And it's like in big bold letters, it's like audition here, it's just like, it just needs to have that. We've even tried to do other things, like practically speaking, we try to have the worship team outside after when everyone's leaving, just to kind of like, say bye to people. And we're like, hey, eventually people are going to see the worship team is out here, and hey, maybe somebody who's a musician is going to just stop by and be like, hey, I play guitar.
Yep.
So, but if we're not creating
Smart.
a clear pathway and it's not accessible for people, then that's just a kind of an easy obstacle for people to never get over,
Man, I think that's so good, because think about what we think about Weekender. We're like, hey, what I always try to say at Weekender is, if you've been at churches before and you're wondering, what do they want me to do? This is it.
Yeah.
You need to go to the Weekender. And I think what you're saying is, you got people that are there that are like, man, how would I even connect? Well, if you make that pathway really easy for them, then it makes it easy for them to lean in. Now, the second thing, though, is not just attracting, right? It's developing the team that is there, or the team that could be in the future. And one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is, I use that phrase from it's a financial book, but The Wealthy Gardener: the seeds of prosperity are planted in the soil of passing days. And, right now, you and I have been here for 12 years. I mean, we're pretty much wishing to God we would have started a worship academy 10 years ago, right? Like, what would happen now? We'd probably be dripping with, well, when's the next best time? It's tomorrow. So, or it's today. So the idea of development of people who are here that are even younger sometimes, we got bigger plans with this, but right now you guys are crushing Essentials. And you have a process that's being replicated. You guys put out a video, 156,000 views, 5,000 comments, just because I think there's such a hunger for development.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me a little bit about Essentials and that process, and even how young some of these kids are getting that we're able to catch them.
Yeah, I think most churches, at least in my experience, they focus specifically on the first thing you said, which is like dragging the magnet through an exhaustive list. I mean, it's just like, we'll go through and think, how many times can we announce it from the stage? Hey, we need musicians. And we'll say this and say that, trying to attract musicians, and usually put all of our eggs in that basket. But to your point, it's like, man, what about the people who have potential but just don't have the skill set and the training to,
Right.
So it's like, if we could put, every other ministry does this. Every other ministry says, hey, just sign up to be in our ministry and we'll give you all of the tools and train you. And worship ministry is typically not approached that way. It's like, we can only take you if you're already an excellent musician. But what we've already found, to be true is like, hey, student ministry is an awesome feeder for us.
Yep.
We have a worship leader now who's just like, she's such an incredible worship leader. She led worship first and played guitar in our student ministry. And so it's like, man, that is like one part of this. And I think it was your idea to be like, hey, what if we just built, this whole thing, like call it Worship Academy. This is part of our deeper thing. And just like, instead of just attracting musicians, we create them.
Yep.
And like going all the way back. And you said there's like even a story with your dad with this, right?
Yeah, I'm very passionate about this, and I'm pretty amazed by what I've seen your team do through Essentials without the Worship Academy starting yet, because to me, when I think of Worship Academy, it's a very big part of our vision over the next 3 years, where we are no longer discovering, worship leaders and worship teams, but we're building them in our own congregation from a younger age. But yeah, my dad was in his 30s and went on a mission trip, and they needed somebody to play the guitar, and he just came back with like a passion for it. And he's 30 something years old and learned how to play the guitar just to go on a mission trip. And now, it's been a huge part of my life. I learned how to play the guitar and led worship for many, many years. And now he uses he's almost he's late 60s, and he plays music in the prisons. That's where he does. He does old hymnal music in the prisons. So cool. And it was all because somebody had the attitude of, we can teach you how to do this. You don't have to already know how to do it. I think rightly, if our model is based only on attraction, there's like, okay, there's a pretty big sheep stealing component in that.
Yeah.
Big churches are going to have people that were trained in small churches through children's choir and blah, blah, blah. And they come up. And man, God moves people around. I want us to attract anybody in our church that can, but I get really excited about stories that I'm hearing about the student ministry with that. I mean, we know one of my son's friends, 13, 14 years old, he just played drums for the first time in students maybe a month ago. That I feel like, off the top of my head, that seems like it's probably been a 1.5 year long process with him, of y'all pouring into him and him coming through essentials and all that stuff. I just think the fruit of that, I envision a day, man, where we are just dripping with musicians and worship leaders. And the bigger vision is that we would be able to send fully staffed teams with our church plants.
Yeah.
We're not going to get there if we are just trying to attract them. We need to build them.
Yeah, almost every single church plant. I mean, when's the last time we sent out a church plant with an entire worship team, a worship leader? I mean, the answer is never. Never. We've sent out a worship leader, and that's awesome. And we've sent out maybe 1 or 2 worship team members.
And production teams, too.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, man, to your point, what if we could send that? Because everyone goes and they, like a church planner will go out and have a team of 20 people with them, and they're like, man, let's go. And then they're like, oh, wait, who's going to lead worship?
Yeah.
And it's just like such an obstacle. And it's like, to your point, man, how cool would it be if we could send out an entire team every time we have a campus? We're not straining everyone to death and being like, what do we do? You have to, you have to play every single week for, months straight and never get it. And it's like, no, what if instead, there's like this lie of like, hey, you have to be a really, really musical person. But the truth is that like it's innate to humanity that everyone is musical. I mean, God is musical and we're made in his image, right? So like, I think there's only like 2% of like statistically, scientifically, 2% of all people are actually tone deaf. That means like 98 people out of 100 could be trained to be on your music team. So if you think of it that way, right? And someone who's tone deaf, you're tone deaf because if somebody hummed "Happy Birthday," they wouldn't be able to tell what you're. That's how extreme it is.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like crazy. It doesn't mean you're going to be the best singer or the best musician, but it can be taught. So if we're like, man, if it can be taught, and most people by age 8, is kind of like that age where it's like, hey, statistically, again, if you can train someone who's like, just like languages, like, man, a 5-year-old or 6-year-old, they could learn a language in like a month. It feels like. Yeah. But it's like for me now as a 39-year-old, I'm like, hey, if I tried to learn a language now, I will never do it. I just can't do it. And it's just like so much. So I'm like, if we can be training, kids when they're younger, that'll feed our student program. It'll feed everything. And so, our vision is next year we want to start the Worship Academy thing, which, we don't have to even get too deep into that. You asked, what are we doing right now? So we have Essentials, which is basically, if you don't know what that is, for us, that's like, is an onboarding program. So it's like somebody auditions, and they may not be there. They may be like 50% of the way there. Maybe they're 80%. Maybe they're like 40%, We, generally speaking, try not to say, hey, sorry, it's a no completely. Now we do, and we have to, and sometimes you have to because someone's not there, but usually what we'll even do for them is, hey, we don't think you're quite ready. So what we think if somebody auditioned and they weren't ready, instead of just saying, sorry, no, go to kids ministry, we would say, hey, if you're passionate about this, we think you could grow in this specific area. And if you want to, here's some steps to do that. And if you want to come back like in a month, 2 months, 3 months and re-audition, you are more than welcome to. And sometimes people do, and they actually will sometimes grow.
That's great.
And it's so cool. And then if somebody's like, man, they've showed they're hungry, they've shown that they're like willing to work, put in the work, then we'll invite them into Essentials, which is like, hey, for 4 weeks, we will go through orientation, which is, we have like this book that we have, I have it here, but it's like all of these books and tools that are like training and giving all of the expectations for everything. And it's like, worship leaders, it's the same thing. It's like, hey, you can sing. You don't have to be a recording artist, but you can sing, and you have a heart for people. You have a heart for ministry. Like, well, dude, let's train you. And so instead of, I feel like for me, a lot of it was, just experience, and most worship leaders, it just takes years and years and years and years to finally, like, you just gradually get better. But if the tools and the systems is already like there, like, hey, something like an Essentials, which we also have for worship leaders specifically, is in place, then it's like, man, you can be trained and coached and resourced and equipped and ready to lead worship or be on the team pretty quickly. And so, yeah, that's something that we've been working on, and to expand development to just, instead of somebody is already good and we're going to take you from 80% to 100%, we're like, man, people might stay in this 4-week program for 2, 3, 4 months. It kind of repeats. And that's okay. Honestly, it's a really enjoyable program. Most people, they get in it and they're like, they love it and they enjoy it, So I think that's just like really important. And the cool thing is that it doesn't just create work, it creates, and more musicians, it creates opportunities for existing worship team members to coach and to pour into. So
they're growing too.
They're growing too, and getting opportunities to like develop. And like a lot of people are like, man, I have a teaching gift, or I have like I'm a developer. I love to just be with people. And it's like, well, dude, come and be a coach at Essentials and give one-on-one interaction coaching to someone who is being raised up, and they love it too, So it's kind of all ships rise in that scenario.
Man, I love that. Well, hey, let's leave it there. We're going to come back and we'll pick up more on this development conversation and a few other topics around developing the worship team and continuing to build that. It can be a bottleneck if we're not careful. So very important conversation, Jon. Thank you. Hey, if you're new to the Breaking Barriers podcast, we want to make sure that you understand that we have one-day events that come up every quarter. And you can check out the ones that are coming up. You can go to breakinggrowthbarriers.com. Thanks.